Remember, then, that the Lord has chosen you to build a house for a sanctuary. Be steadfast and do it. A brief history is constrained not only by time, but also by point of view. It is told after the story began, and in the hope it never ends. In the summer of 1886, the First Presbyterian Church of Moorestown had its beginning in this home, which was the residence of Thomas S. Collins on Main Street. Through the efforts of Mr. Collins, Mrs. Anna J. C. Bennett, and Mrs. Mattie Gilden, worship services were begun and held here regularly until winter, when they were discontinued. This home was originally known as the Haynes Spencer House. In 1790, a one-room house was built on this site by John Haynes. In 1836, Dr. J. J. Spencer bought and enlarged the house. Mr. and Mrs. George Peck purchased the house in 1968 and lived there with their family for more than 20 years. Fay Peck and her daughter Elizabeth are members of our church. The Grange Hall was the location of the first worship service conducted by the Reverend D. C. Porter on February 13, 1887. Mr. Porter was the pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Mount Holly. Interest was so encouraging that Mr. Porter drove the 8 miles from Mount Holly to Moorestown every Sunday afternoon to conduct services without remuneration. Upon the death of the Reverend Porter, Edward P. Hodge of Burlington was named to succeed him as chair of the committee, quote, in charge of the work in Moorestown, end quote. In September of 1887, the committee decided to substitute morning and evening services for the afternoon services. The Grange Hall continued to be the meeting place until the end of the year. In the spring of 1887, cottage prayer meetings were resumed and usually held here or the Collings property. In a newspaper clipping on file at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, it was noted that the church received a very valuable silver service for communion from Mr. N. K. Bennett. 2 members of our congregation, Mary Green and Helen Champlin, have lived in this house since 1946 and 1950, respectively. Anna Jane C.F. Bennett was one of the founders of the church, and it was she on whom the Reverend Porter called during 1887. These visits resulted in worship services being conducted by Mr. Porter that winter. In January of 1888, worship services were moved to Hewlings Hall. The second floor, over Garrick's grocery store, was especially built for church services. Preaching was done mostly by students of Princeton Theological Seminary. One of the students, George S. Swayze, organized the Sunday school with an enrollment of 35 students. This building was moved to another location on 3rd Street and is now a residence. Does anyone know its location? On the evening of May 14, 1881, the Committee on a Church Site met to consider the question of purchasing a lot owned by Miss Burr on Chester Avenue, and unanimously approved the purchase of a 90-foot frontage at a cost of $27 per running foot of front. The cornerstone was laid on October 8, 1891. The total cost of this church building was $19,000. Adhering to a strong tradition of fiscal responsibility, the congregation did not formally dedicate its new building until the mortgage debt was retired on Thanksgiving Day, 1895. A chapter house, which was used for Sunday school and meetings, was added in 1916 at a cost of $15,000. The Reverend Chalmers Martin served 1888 to 1891. Under his capable direction, preparations for organization proceeded rapidly, and the Committee of the Presbytery of Monmouth commissioned to organize the church, met in Hewling Hall on Wednesday, September 12, 1888, at 7:30 p.m. 55 persons were considered charter members of the church. The Reverend William P. Finney was installed on Wednesday, June 28, 1892, at a salary of $1,000 per year. During his ministry, the entire cost of $19,000, including a mortgage of $2,500, was paid off. The membership grew from 66 to over 200 before the end of his pastorate on May 10, 1910. The Reverend Edward Haynes Kistler was installed as the third regular minister on November 18, 1910, and served until May 23, 1913. On May 8, 1914, the Reverend John Snyder Carlisle was ordained and installed as the fourth minister. He resigned December 14, 1917, to become a chaplain in the armed forces. Under his ministry, membership grew to 141, and the Sunday school building, known as the Chapter House, was added to the church house at a cost of $15,000. In 1923, the original church building was remodeled from the frame country-style building with a spire to a stucco cottage-style building capable of meeting the needs of a growing congregation. In 1926, a manse was built at 130 Chestnut Street. In 1944, the King's Chest Committee was formed through the trustees to help with the expansion of the church building. Much discussion took place as to whether to expand the present building or build a larger facility. The Reverend J. Shackelford Dougherty ministered from 1918 to 1945, serving longer than any other pastor in the history of our congregation. Under his ministry, the church was remodeled, a new manse was built, and the membership grew to 244 with Sunday school enrollment of 97. Reverend E. Crawford Williams was called in 1946 following a vacancy in the pulpit of nearly a year. The membership increased greatly to 584 new members by the time he resigned October 15, 1956. Under his ministry, the session increased from 6 to 12. Westminster Junior and Senior Fellowships were formed. A large board of ushers came into being. A women's association was formed. A board of deacons was ordained. The new sanctuary was built at Riverton and Bridgeboro Roads. On August 9, 1950, the Reverend Williams approached Mrs. Irving A. Collins with the possibility of purchasing the Collins 23-acre estate as a site for a new building for the congregation of the Presbyterian Church. It became necessary on September 12, 1950, on a few hours' notice and with no time for a congregational meeting or presbytery approval, to make a down payment of $5,000 to hold the property. A hastily called meeting of officers, members, and friends produced the required amount. The total price of the property was $35,000. The residence was remodeled and was dedicated on April 8, 1951. Sunday school was held in the stables. In the spring of 1955, the cornerstone of the remodeled church on Chester Avenue was opened, and the following items were found among the contents: a list of church members, a carpenter's and builder's card, copies of The Press of Philadelphia, dated 10/8/1891, the Moorestown Chronicle, same date, the Moorestown Republican, dated October 7, 1891. Some of these articles were placed in the cornerstone of the new sanctuary at Riverton and Bridgeboro. The first service was held in the new sanctuary April 22, 1956, with the service of dedication on October 7, 1956. On November 3, 1957, the Reverend Dr. Harold L. Myers, Jr. was installed as the seventh pastor. Ministry during his 23-year tenure included a membership peak of 1,519 members in 1973. Session members increased to 18, and added to the staff were Director of Christian Education, Organist and Director of Music, and Superintendent of Buildings and Grounds. The education building was completed and dedicated in 1962. An assistant pastor, Fred F. Missel, was engaged in 1964, and then in 1968 he was called as associate pastor. His pastorate ended in 1983. Dr. Myers retired in 1980 and was elected pastor emeritus. The congregation called Dr. Robert A. Shires in 1982, and an associate pastor in December 1984, Dr. Nancy Wong. Dr. Wong resigned in 1987, and in June of 1987, Kevin Stanton was installed as associate pastor. In 1988, the church celebrated its 100th anniversary. Many events of celebration were held. Pictured here is Dirk Dykerman, the superintendent of Buildings and Grounds, with a time capsule made by him to house memorabilia. It is to be opened in the year 2088. After the resignation of Dr. Shires in 1989, the Reverend Dewey Dodds was our interim pastor until he was honorably retired in 1990. Dr. John C. Burkhorst served 1990 to 1993. James C. King was called in 1993 as associate. Bryant Kirkland was our interim pastor 1993 through 1994. The present pastor, Dr. Jonathan Miller, was installed in September of 1994. Where we have been, or what we have accomplished, are interesting and important. but not nearly as important as where we are going and what we can achieve with a vision toward the future built on faith.